Hello, everyone. We are finally in for our next video, which fortunately I was not able to get to last week, but we are going to go ahead this week and get it done on the Monday. So for this week's video, given that this year is going to kind of be a big year here in the American consciousness, it is for those who live here in the United States, they may or may not be aware that this year will be the 250th anniversary of the United States' founding. Now, technically, the American Revolution would have started 250 years ago last year in 2025, but we celebrate our country's birthday on July 4th for 1776 is when we consider it, because that was when we officially declared independence of Great Britain, and so that makes 2026 the 250th year of the United States being a nation. So this year is going to be rather big in that regard, and as I'm sure as the year goes out, I'm going to cover quite a few topics related to the revolution to kind of tie in with that, especially as we get closer to July 4th. But for today, we're going to cover one of those topics that is something that happens a little before the revolution breaks out, but it's something that is very pivotal and something that leads to the revolution itself. I know in the past I covered the revolution kind of in full, but this we're going to take some specific looks at certain topics. And for this week, we're going to go ahead here and take a look at what we call the Stamp and Sugar Acts, which are perhaps the two first taxation acts that the British Parliament ends up passing that end up really getting the American colonists angry at the British government and starting to get them riled up to the point that they're going to ultimately start a revolution over the issue. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Americans do not like to pay taxes. We started a revolution over paying taxes, and now we gripe and complain about paying taxes now. So that's never changed. The only difference is now we've not started a revolution over the thing. So for the Stamp and Sugar Acts, we have to go back to before the revolution because all this happens before. And the starting year for where this story could begin would be at the very end of the Seven Years' War, also known here in North America as the French and Indian War. And that ended in 1763. Now, mind you, the American Revolution will start in 1775, so roughly about 12 years down the road. Now, the end of the Seven Years' War came about, as we said. It was 1763 with the Treaty of Paris. In this treaty, France was officially defeated and forced to cede all of its North American holdings east of the Mississippi River and its holding in Canada to Great Britain. These all became British territories. Spain, having been a French ally, also had to give up quite a bit of land in its own. Most notably, it gave up Florida to the British, but in large part, this was a loss of the French. And Britain now has a massive territorial holding on the North American continent. They've ousted their long held colonial rivals, the French, pretty much from the North American mainland, with the French only maintaining a few islands off of Nova Scotia and a couple in the Caribbean. And all of the new French territory, French Louisiana, Canada, the colony of Quebec, that is all now British land, except for Louisiana, which is given to the Spanish. Now, Britain would emerge from the Seven Years' War with an enlarged colonial empire, but it would soon find new issues regarding defending that new territory that it had just acquired. Most notably in North America, where the colonists now began settling the new lands that the British government had just acquired west of the Appalachian Mountains, which started to pose a problem. Because while the colonists had helped and support the British war effort under the idea that the French would be kicked out and they would be free to go and settle west, as they started to do so, they came into conflict with the Native Americans living in those areas, most notably right here in the Ohio Valley, right here in the state of Ohio where I live. This was one of those big areas that the settlers were moving into after the British victory in the war, and it ended up causing quite a bit of problems with the natives. Now, the British forts and outposts ended up getting attacked shortly after the end of the Seven Years' War because there ended up being a Native American rebellion that we often know as Pontiac's Rebellion, after the Ottawa or Odawa war chief Pontiac, who was the leader of this little rebellion against British authority and trying to maintain the settlers west not west, but east of the Appalachian Mountains. And they started to attack British forts. They started to attack British installations. They attacked settlements to try to force the colonists to back off, stay out of these lands. These are our lands. In October of 1763, new king, who's only been on the throne for like 3 years at this point, King George III would issue a royal proclamation. In this, what we call the Proclamation of 1763, King George would forbid the colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. And basically, this was meant to kind of placate the Native Americans because Britain had just fought a 7-year war, literally, and they are already heavily in debt, and they have a lot of military debt that they need to pay back. They have a lot of money in general. The government, want to downsize the military, and they can't do that if they're having to fight Native Americans immediately after the war's over. So in order to kind of keep the Native Americans calm and keep them, as placable subjects within the British Empire, the British make the decision, okay, if it'll keep you guys, without challenging and attacking our outposts, we'll keep the settlers out of here, just to keep the peace. That is fine with the British government. It's not fine with the colonists who now feel like they've been stabbed in the back because many of the colonists that had volunteered to join in the war effort had joined under the condition that they were going to get land after this, that Britain was going to expand its holdings into French territory, which it had, and that they would get some of that land for themselves to settle. And many of them now were not going to get those land grants because now it was forbidden that you could even settle west. So many of the colonists are like, okay, wait a minute. This was supposed to make us safer, but at the same time allow us more space to grow. But now we're not allowed to expand. They felt cheated, is what they did. And there were quite a few wealthy land speculators that got involved in this as well, and they were quite angry. One of which was actually George Washington, who had substantial land claims west of the Appalachian Mountains and was now being denied them by the British government, by the Crown. Now, American colonists did not. And this is where eventually it's going to cause some other issues. The American colonists, despite the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and it being derided by the American colonists, it ultimately was largely ignored by the colonists. The colonists continued to settle westward anyway, despite the Crown having strictly forbade them from doing so, which ended up putting more conflict between the colonies and the British government back home. After putting down Pontiac's rebellion in 1764, the British Parliament decided that new steps would be needed in order to ensure peace in the American colonies, in order to protect them and keep the order, and hopefully maybe enforce the proclamation line of 1763. They needed to have some sort of a military force in the colonies. But that presented its own issues because, as we mentioned, Britain is very much in debt. And while the colonies do need added measures for defense and, keeping the peace, Britain does have the issue that where are we going to find the money to actually fund these troops that we're going to send over? Britain would ultimately decide that they would send approximately 10,000 British regulars in order to enforce the proclamation line. The cost of maintenance would be at least over 200,000 British pounds annually, a year. That's quite a bit of money considering you're a little strapped for cash. Now, Britain was already saddled with this war debt. They need new sources of money in order to help pay that off and to fund the new measures that they're going to undertake in the colonies in order to keep the peace and to defend them. Many in Parliament came with the idea that, okay, so we need some new revenue sources to get, the money that we need in order to pay off our war debt. Why shouldn't we not tax the colonies? Did they not benefit from the war perhaps the most, more than any other British citizen? They were threatened by the French territory in North America, which is now ours. They no longer have the French to worry about, and they were able to somewhat expand their territorial holdings in a way. So, did they not benefit most out of this war effort? And many in Parliament started to propose that idea that the American colonies they would not be the sole contributor to paying off the debt. No, there would be taxes levied back home as well. But they thought, in a stark breakthrough from what had come previously, the British Parliament started to consider the idea that the American colonies should help pay, and they should pay some of the burden, since they had benefited from the war. On April 5th of 1764, British Prime Minister George Grenville passed the Sugar Act. Act through Parliament. This was an extension of an already existing law, the 1733 Molasses Act. And what it did was impose a tax of 3 pence per gallon of molasses that was produced outside the British Empire. It also restricted trade of valuable goods from the colonies, like lumber, to Britain alone. This was going to cause some issues because now the tax on sugar, I don't think, was so much the issue. It was already in existence that there was already a 3 pence per gallon tax on molasses. This was simply an extension of that law. However, what was the major change here was it restricted the trade of the valuable goods like lumber and other materials to only Britain, so the colonies were kind of not really for that at all, and you'll see why here in a second. It was met harshly by the colonies, especially New England, which had a lot of seafaring merchants, because colonial merchants often relied on foreign molasses from the Dutch and the French, and they often could get better prices on their luxury goods like lumber, gold, iron, stuff like that. They could get much better prices for that stuff in foreign markets, and now Britain's saying, well, if it's a luxury good, you can only sell it in Britain or in the colonies. You cannot sell it to French merchants. You can't sell it to the Dutch. You can't sell it to the Spanish. You have to sell it either in the colonies themselves or you have to send it back home to be sold, which means that they're going to have a lot less choice on their sell price because there's only going to be so much that they can sell it for in the colonies and only so much that they can sell it for back home. This is going to cause issues. So, what ends up happening because of the Sugar Act is the colonists start to boycott luxuries from Britain being imported. They start refusing to buy them, and they petition Parliament to repeal the Sugar Act as a consequence. Violence would also break out, especially in the colony of Rhode Island, where British customs officials were often bullied, intimidated, and even jailed simply for trying to undertake their duties. Now, the Sugar Act would enrage colonial merchants, as we've seen, but it didn't affect most colonists. Most colonists weren't everyday merchants trading in, luxury goods and trading in molasses, which cost quite a bit of good amount of money back then. And so, because not every colonist was exposed or affected by the Sugar Act, overall protest remained quite low due to the Sugar Act. It wasn't until the next act came about that things are going to start getting a little bit more heated. By mid 1764, rumor had spread to the colonies that Prime Minister Grenville was seeking to implement a new tax on paper documents. This would affect pretty much every colonist because when we talk in paper documents, we mean anything like marriage licenses, deeds, wills, newspapers, if anything of that manner, any kind of official government form, diplomas, degrees, stuff, anything that's on paper would be, or a paper product would be subject to this proposed tax. And this would affect pretty much everybody. So this is going to cause a lot more outrage if it passes. Four colonial agents were sent to London as a consequence on February 2nd, 1765, in order to speak with the Prime Minister. Benjamin Franklin was among these four colonial agents that was sent to try to explain to the Prime Minister and inform him that the colonists feared the proposed tax, emphasizing that the colonies preferred to tax themselves. They did not like this idea of the British Parliament taxing them for them. They basically argued that if Parliament robbed the colonies of this ability to tax themselves, it might subvert representative government in America. The royal governors, for example, their argument was if you do this and you take power to tax the colonies, you take the power of the colonies to tax themselves away from them. What will end up happening is the royal governors would have no reason to convene colonial assemblies because the colonial assemblies won't really be responsible for any legislation because it's being dictated to by Parliament. And thus, the royal governors will have no reason to even have the assemblies, which is one of the things that the American colonies kind of pride themselves on is having some form of, elected government there and having representative government in the colonies, just like there is in England. Now, Grenville would assure the agents that he considered the colony's concerns. That he was not doing this cold-heartedly. He was doing this with colonial concerns in mind, that he had taken them into consideration. However, he expressed his belief that the colonies needed to help pay for their own defense. And since no alternative was proposed by the colonial agents that came to meet with him, the vote was going to be held anyway, since he's like, I'd be more than happy to, come up to possibly propose something else. But here's the thing: neither you nor anyone in Parliament has come up with a possible alternative, and thus we have to go with what we have. On February 6th, 1765, Grenville will bring his tax proposal before the British House of Commons in Parliament. The debate surrounding the Stamp Act was unlike that had preceded during the Sugar Act. Charles Townshend, a notable British politician at the time, would defend Grenville's proposal as one of his most staunch allies. He described Americans as, quote, children planted by our care and nourished up by our indulgence. This was rapidly refuted very quickly by one of his colleagues. Now, Townsend went on after he said this he asked why the colonists should be allowed to refuse shouldering the financial burden of their own defense when they help benefit from the war more than anybody else. Once he got done speaking, one of the other members of the House of Commons, the Anglo Irish Colonel Isaac Barr, would issue the following response to Townsend's comments. And this was his response. It's a little lengthy here, but I felt it was worth including. And he stated the following: they planted by your care. No, your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country where they exposed themselves to almost all hardships to which human nature is liable. They nourished up by your indulgence, they grew up by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them, to spy out their liberty, to misrepresent their actions, and to prey upon them. Men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of these sons of liberty to recoil within them. Despite Colonel Barr's remarks indicating that Townsend was a fool for thinking, oh, somehow that these guys, somehow these guys were nourished up by our care, he's pointed the obvious out that up until recently, Britain had taken a pretty lax hand with the colonies, and the colonies had prospered because of it. And he brought up the factor what you're doing now is a misrepresentation of how these colonies have prospered. If you put this act in, it's going to cause issues. Now, despite Colonel Barr's remarks and that of the opposition, his his compatriots, the stamp bill would receive its first reading on February 13th of 1765. Opposition requested that several petitions from Massachusetts, Virginia, and Connecticut be introduced and read to the House of Commons, but ultimately it was refused to do so through by vote. So these petitions from the colonies that were expressing their opinions of what was going to happen and their distrust of the proposed Stamp Act tax were not even read to the Parliament because they were outvoted. The bill was approved by a vote of 245 in favor against 49 against in the House of Commons, and it would unanimously then go to pass the House of Lords. On March 22nd, 1765, King George III signed the bill into law, and was set to take effect on November 1st for the colonies. So the Stamp Act is now law. It's now going to happen, and that is going to create a whole nother issue. So the Stamp Act was, in effect, it was the first direct tax imposed by Parliament on the American colonies. The Sugar Act was simply a tax on trade. This was a direct tax on the colonies themselves. It would require all paper documents to carry stamps that would represent the tax that had been paid. So if you paid the tax, it would have a stamp that would have been paid for by that tax. Legal and documents that were subject to the law included legal contracts, diplomas, newspapers, marriage licenses, almanacs, wills, calendars, and playing cards even. All this would have to have a tax paid when buying it, and have to be stamped with a tax stamp in order to indicate that the tax had been paid. Stamps would be distributed by political appointees that were appointed directly by the Crown. They were not appointed by the colonial legislatures or by Parliament themselves. So thus, the colonies had a problem. We have no control over these appointees. And they could only be purchased with British hard currency, with British pounds, which were not very plentiful in the colonies, and more plentiful in the colonies was colonial paper currency. These could not be used to buy the stamps, which would also create issues. Anyone that was caught violating the act could be brought before a admiralty court and be judged by a judge that was appointed by the king, not a jury of their peers. Which you can kind of see very rapidly where this is going to go, because colonists have a different idea of what representative government meant to them. They were more used to the lax, hands off approach that Britain gave them, and now Britain's starting to actually take a more direct control of their colonies, and they're not liking it. The differing viewpoints of Parliament and the colonists on American identity are critical to understanding why the Stamp Act was so hard for them to understand. And it comes because there's two different views. Parliament has one view of what the American colonies are, and the American colonies have their own view of what they are. Both sides regarded the colonists as Britons. American colonists did not at this point think that they were an independent country. They very much considered themselves British subjects, but they differed on what exactly that meant. The American colonists believed that since they were considered to be British subjects, that they retained the rights of Englishmen back home, including the right to tax themselves in the New World. This was not something that they thought that they had sacrificed coming to the colonies. This was a basic pillar of representative government, and it influenced the creation of colonial legislatures. Was this power to tax themselves and do kind of do have representative government in the colonies? This was something that the colonies believed they had not lost by becoming colonists and coming over to the New World. It was something they had inherited as their right as Englishmen. The Parliament instead held the belief that the colonists weren't any different from the 90% of Britons who owned no land and therefore couldn't vote back in Britain. They claimed to virtually represent the interests of colonists who should be subject to the same mandates that affected all British citizens, subjects, which also caused a problem because Americans have this idea that since they are British subjects, they should have representation. Well, back home, there's members of the home country that do not have representation in parliament and aren't even able to vote. So it ain't any different from that. Well, the American colonists saying, well, how are you putting a tax on us for with a body that we have no say in? We don't even have a representative in there. We don't have any elections here to help determine that. And the parliament saying, "What are you talking about? Like, there's people here that can't vote. What are you griping about?" The American colonists would protest the Sugar and Stamp Acts based on the belief that Parliament had no authority to tax the colonies, since colonists had no representation in Parliament. Thus, the most famous saying from this time period, no taxation without representation. Samuel Adams, one of the later founding fathers, would state that the Parliament's imposition of a tax without colonial consent would transform Americans from, quote, the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves. He had the view that Britain doing this was authoritarian, it was dictator-like, it was not something of representative government, even though, to be honest here, I don't think Britain was in the wrong. It was British colonies, and they're making a valid point. Why would we give you the right to vote when there's people back home that don't have the right to vote? You don't see them griping. So in early April, shortly after, mind you, the Stamp Act passes in March, it's not set to go effect until November. Colonies would receive news of the Stamp Act's passage. For 6 weeks, no colonial legislature challenged the act. They let it stand because I think more or less because many of them were too afraid to make the first move to do anything against it. First move would come in late May of 1765 in the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the colonial legislature of Virginia, which was winding down its legislative session at the time. Only 39 out of 116 legislators were actually present when 29-year-old delegate Patrick Henry stood up and proposed four resolutions that became known as the Virginia Resolves. Henry's resolves acknowledged that the colonists retained the same rights as Englishmen, including to tax themselves. It basically reiterated many of the gripes that the colonists had with the Stamp Act. It passed the House of Burgesses and was reprinted in newspaper throughout the other 12 colonies. By the end of the year, 8 other colonies would follow Virginia by renouncing the Stamp Act and rejecting Parliament's authority to tax them, basically saying that we view this law as illegitimate and we will oppose it in every means necessary. In October of that year, the Stamp Act Congress would meet in New York City. Representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies would gather in the first major gathering of colonial representatives since the 1754 Albany Congress that had come together during the French and Indian War to try to determine the best defense strategy for the colonies. The Stamp Act Congress would issue a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which would echo many claims in Henry's Virginia Resolves from earlier that year. The Stamp Act Congress was a vital thing that kind of started to turn public opinion in Britain because not only were the boycotts starting to hurt Britain, which the colonies were boycotting buying these goods, they were boycotting buying newspapers, they were boycotting the sugar, they were boycotting in any way that they could, buying something that would have to have them pay this tax, which is bad for the British economy. And the Stamp Act Congress would worry Parliament even further because this is showing a level of unity in the colonies and coordination that they had not expected the colonies to undertake. And this is kind of getting worrying to them because they thought, oh, yeah, there'll be some isolated rabble that won't like the tax. Now it's becoming a concerted opposition effort. They don't like that, and they're scared by it. So, just to show, we don't have a whole lot of images here for this. But here is an image of kind of the architect of this whole scenario. So this is Prime Minister George Grenville. This is a depiction of what he looked like. He was Prime Minister from 1763 till 1765. By the time, and as we'll see here, by the time the Stamp Act ended up getting repealed, he was no longer Prime Minister, but he was still in Parliament and was the head of the opposition that was still advocating to keep it in place. And here is an image of this is a proof sheet as far as what I'm told, but this is an image of what some of the stamps would have looked like. These were 1 penny stamps that would have been placed at the price of 1 penny on certain paper documents, but this is something what they would have looked like. I just wanted to hold off here. So some groups of colonists would take more direct action against the stamp. They were not content to simply oppose the Stamp Act by, protesting and making big scenes in the colonial legislatures. The epicenter of riots that would break out were nonetheless in that famous city that during the Revolution was probably the hotbed of all violent activity, Boston, Massachusetts. So, a group of men in Boston, known as the Loyal Nine, would end up leading most of the riots that broke out in the city around this time. They included artisans, shopkeepers, and printers. Sam Adams and John Hancock, future founding fathers, did support the Loyal Nine, but despite not being members themselves. The Loyal Nine managed to unite the rival gang mobs of Boston's North and South Ends under cobbler Ebenezer McIntosh. McIntosh was directed by the Royal Nine to redirect the fury of his united mobs towards the Stamp Act and its collectors. Andrew Oliver, who was to be the stamp distributor for Massachusetts, for the colony of Massachusetts, would soon become the target of many of the riots. On August 14th of 1765, an effigy of Oliver was found hanging from an elm tree in the city. Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, ordered the local sheriff to cut it down, which the sheriff ultimately refused to do, citing that the anger of the crowd would likely cost him and his men their lives if they tried to remove the effigy. That evening, McIntosh was roused the mobs, removing the effigy, and then carrying the effigy and marching to Oliver's office, where the mob proceeded to tear the its entire structure to the ground. The mob would also ransack Oliver's house, while calls to kill him caused multiple houses to be searched. Luckily for Oliver, he had fled to safe haven in Boston Harbor, which is likely can be attributed to what probably saved his life. Had the mob actually gotten a hold of him, they probably would have killed him. Oliver would resign his post the next day after the events at his office and his house, but the mob was still angry. They ended up attacking the residence of Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson on August 26, stealing anything inside that was movable. Hutchinson was luckily not home at the time, and riots would start to break out in other colonies as well over the Stamp Act, and this was something that just it kicked off in Boston, but it spread to the other colonies. The tree that Oliver's effigy was hung on became the first Liberty Tree, which would become a more significant factor during the American Revolution. And the riots in Boston were also dated as when the Sons of Liberty were officially established by Sam Adams in opposition to British policies, which would become kind of the main agitators of colonial resistance to British taxes and colonial measures in the years to come leading up to the outbreak of the American Revolution. Massachusetts wasn't the only colony to experience rioting by any long shot. Stamp distributors' houses in Newport, Rhode Island would also be ransacked, and in New Hampshire, the stamp distributor George Meserve resigned his post upon arriving in Boston to avoid the wrath of the mob that had assembled there waiting for him to get off and head up to New Hampshire. Other stamp distributors in the colonies of New York, North Carolina, and Georgia would also resign their commissions in order to avoid the mob that had assembled to try to hurt them. Back in London, concern over the Stamp Act had arisen as news of American violence started to reach Parliament. Trade with the colonies was in decline due to merchants boycotting British goods, and thus British merchants began advocating that the act should be repealed. That they argued that this is hurting our business, the colonists aren't buying our goods, and they're not selling their goods to us. They won't do it. They are absolutely opposed to this act. If you want the economy to start flowing again, you need to repeal this thing. Now, the primary supporter of the Stamp Act, former Prime Minister George Grenville, was now no longer the Prime Minister, but he did remain in Parliament, as we had said. The new Prime Minister was Lord Rockingham, and he was not a big fan of the Stamp Act to begin with. When Parliament reconvened in December of 1765, the Stamp Act was perhaps the most pressing issue of all. King George III actually referred to the situation in America in his opening speech to Parliament, but he didn't fully reveal the extent of resistance that was developing there. Grenville would propose an amendment to condemn colonial resistance, which was ultimately rejected by the Parliament, by the House of Commons, to actually do so. Grenville's supporters would claim that would ultimately start to claim that repealing the Stamp Act would set a dangerous precedent, and it would give in to colonial demands when they should be subservient to Parliament and to the Crown. London merchants would begin cooperating in contrast with Rockingham's ministry in order to help get the Stamp Act repealed. Grenville, even as a simple member of the House of Commons, he was still more than determined to defend the act that he had largely put through, and he was going to do that till the bitter end, while his compatriots were more inclined to just get rid of it, and they were kind of listening to the people. It wasn't just the colonists that were upset, the British merchants were upset. The British economy was slumping over this because of reduced trade from the 13 colonies, and that was due to the boycotts due to the Stamp Act. Parliament would reconvene on January 14th, 1766, and Rockingham proposed a repeal, with reading petitions from hundreds of British merchants as proof that it needed to be done. Grenville's followers proposed a resolution on February 7th that the House of Commons should back the King in support of the Stamp Act, but this too would be rejected, just like Grenville's earlier one to condemn colonial resistance. Testimony was heard from between February 11th and 13th from many witnesses, including colonial ones such as Ben Franklin, who had come to England once again in order to voice the colonists' disdain for the act. On the 21st of February, a resolution to repeal the Stamp Act was officially introduced in the House of Commons, and it ended up passing by a vote of 266 for against 168 against. King George III would give his approval on St. Patrick's Day on March 17th, 1766, officially repealing the Stamp Act. Now, while the Stamp Act was gone, Parliament did take measures to kind of exert that while we do repeal this, to hopefully get the economy back on right, we want to make one thing clear. We do have the authority over you to tax you when we need to. You may have won this, but be aware, in the future, when we put a tax down, you will pay it. You are British colonies, you are British subjects, you are subject to our laws. And to do that, Parliament would pass the Declaratory Act in conjunction with the Stamp Act's repeal, stipulating that it held the power to make binding laws for their colonies, including in regards to taxation. This would also soon be followed by the Townshend Acts, which would be another tax on multiple goods that would also end up causing issues for the American colonists in their British homeland. And again, both of these, both the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, and the Townshend Acts, and the Declaratory Act, would all help contribute to the growing anger and resentment in the colonies toward British rule that would ultimately explode in 1775 when the American Revolution would break out at Lexington and Concord. So for our final little two images here, we just have two political cartoons from that time, from 1766. And this one is that appeared in an English newspaper deriding the repeal of the Stamp Act and indicating that, repealing this was conceding to America, that this was not right. that America is now somehow calling the shots over the British government, even though they're the colonies and they should not be. So this appeared in an English newspaper in 1766, and it's deriding the repeal of the Stamp Act, basically deriding Parliament for giving in to the American resistance. At the time, America was often in British caricatures were kind of depicted as, like a Native American almost. And then here we have an image. I don't know from whether this was in the colonies or if it came from. We have no idea of knowing if this was from the colonies or if it was, maybe it was back in England, but I'm gonna guess this could have come from the colonies just given the artwork, and I've seen some colonial caricatures from that time. But this is also depicting the repeal of the Stamp Act, but kind of a more fun way because it's showing, this procession from Parliament carrying the coffin of a young child. The one holding the coffin is supposed to be Grenville, and it's him holding what the coffin of a young child label that is dated to have been born in 1765 and died in 1766, meaning the coffin symbolizing the Stamp Act itself. And then one part that I had just noticed is it seems like this dog here might be peeing on the guy in the front's leg. So maybe it's an insult to him. Don't know if that is actually what he's doing, but it kind of looks that way. So, yes, that I think concludes for this video. So, if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added information, feel free to put it into the comment section. I'll be more than happy to go through it when I get the opportunity to do so. I do not at this moment have something set for next week, but we will have a video out. I'm hoping this weekend, if everything goes well, I might get to go up to Michigan and go up to the um, River Raisin Battlefield, which hopefully I get to do that, providing the weather cooperates. And if that happens, maybe I might end up doing a separate video on the River Raisin, which I think I mentioned when I did Fort Meigs, but maybe not the most in depth. But we'll take a review at it and see if I can do something else with it. So but again, if anyone has any ideas or any suggestions for something that they'd like to see covered, feel free to put it in there, and I'll be more than happy to go through it and see if it's something I can actually cover on the channel. So that I think will wrap it up for today. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video when it comes out.